Welcome back to my YouTube, everybody. For this week's video, I would like to go through a layout design for a relatively small N-scale layout. The space available is only about 10 feet square. Although the room is somewhat bigger, the red line here is the approximate limit of the railroad space. So top to bottom is exactly 10 feet and right to left is about 9'8". Although we did actually gain a few more inches. So the L shape ended up very close to 10 by 10. And even in N scale, there is a limit to how much you can get into 100 square feet, especially when you have to consider that part of the space has to be left available for other purposes. The message I originally got from the customer a few months ago said quite simply, "Would like to discuss custom model railroad design with you, as after 2.5 years I've realized that my desires exceed my design capabilities." Now the customer wanted quite a lot of varied operations. He wanted partially double track and partially single track main lines. He wanted 2 coal mines, one large, one small. Container yard with an overhead crane. He wanted 1 large through passenger station and several smaller stations. He wanted rural towns. He wanted a harbour scene with a coal dumper. He wanted to be able to turn trains in the staging yard. He wanted ore traffic, grain traffic. He wanted some specific bridges. He wanted the Maniac Bridge, I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, the safe Harbour Trestle, and a representation of the Rockville Bridge in Harrisburg. And he already had a very expensive structure kit by the N-scale architect. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is from the rear. It has the distinctive 2 tall towers on the front elevation. It's quite an impressive station. Even in N scale, it's 20 inches long. And although we were both thinking that we probably wouldn't get the whole thing in, at least he wanted to be able to use most of it. So here is the empty room. Turns out the couch wasn't quite in the right place. There's something else in this corner, I don't know what, but the couch has to be a few more inches the other way under the layout. So even though he was on board with the idea of 2 scenic decks and subterranean staging on a 3rd deck, the staging yard would have to stop short of this red line at both here and over the other side, where there is a 30-inch tall cabinet underneath the railroad. So with the limited space available and a lot of things on the customer's want list, what was I supposed to do? I talked it over with him and we came up with the idea of trying to find a couple of scenes that could get most of the elements pushed together and just hinted at while making a good job of a few of the more important ones. Let me find the first drawing that I did. It shows the idea of how I'm going to use the space with a double track helix in the bottom corner, the main line coming up from staging, running along the back of the layout over a very much compressed rendition of the Rockville Bridge, winding up and then coming through the main town on the diagonal before heading up to the upper deck. And the smaller section available at one end would just be an industrial suburb containing most of his switching opportunities. And then on the upper deck, the helix comes out and splits into 2 single track routes. We're running a small town with a small coal sorting yard, also on the diagonal, but the other way, and then coming back along the back of the layout over the safe Harbour Trestle, which was quite an impressive bridge. Let me see if I can find a picture of that. Here is the trestle. It really needs a scene by itself, but if we look closely we can see that there are other tracks running along in front of it. So using it as a backdrop for the small town and yard I don't think is too far-fetched. And it also looks as though it is on a slight curve as well, which I have duplicated on the model. Here it is at the back. And on the lower deck in the staging yard, it's important that I don't foul where the furniture goes. And I wanted to get as much staging in there as I reasonably could. He listed 8 different trains that he wanted staged. So that was my starting point. One of the former model railroader editors is famous for his formula to calculate the required capacity of a staging yard. He said to start by figuring out the highest number of trains you would ever want to stage, and then add 1, and then when you've done that, double it. And although it was said somewhat in jest, it's not far off the truth. So that calculation would put the staging requirements for this layout at 18 tracks, and clearly that wasn't going to be viable. This one shows 10. I was eventually able to get an 11th track in. A few of the longer tracks would even be able to store 2 of the shorter trains, one behind the other. Whereas on the rest of the layout, I was deliberately trying to avoid squeezing in too much track. I wanted to keep them fairly open because you wanted large expanses of scenery and a good number of city buildings. So I tried to leave plenty of room for those. And on the upper deck, also the fairly low track density. That idea didn't last long, as with every iteration of the plan, he had me adding more track. Here is the middle deck version 2. As you can see, we now have a freight yard, 2 extra double-ended tracks and 2 single-ended tracks added in. We've also added more trackage for handling of longer trains at this yard, at least in one direction anyway. And I started fleshing out the industrial area here. We'd already talked about whether the benchwork edge should be behind or in front of the cabinet that is down here. And we decided that adding a few extra inches would be a good idea, especially considering what he wanted to include. And although this changed quite a lot, it served to determine how best to use the space here. One of the things he asked for at this point was to rearrange the passenger station, to add at least 1 extra through track and an express dock, and to reposition the main structure over the top of the tracks. So I did that here. Now these express docks aren't very long, but we decided that they can extend most of the way under the station. It's probably actually possible to have one of these extended and join up at the other end as well. But there was other things that I wanted to do here without squeezing the Susquehanna River too much, because it is a very wide river and I wanted to do a reasonable job of it. We also talked about what form the coal dumper should take. Let me find the photograph that I worked from. This is a place called Jack's Run in Pittsburgh, and we can see here we have barge traffic along the river. We have many coal storage tracks and at least 2 tracks here for unloading hoppers, with a series of gravity feeds and conveyors to load the barges. And although it continues into the distance with many separate facilities, the idea is just to represent one of those on the layout. And also, if we go back to this one, we can see that I had 2 long tracks for a container yard. So I thought he meant modern shipping containers. And then he clarified it that he meant LCL containers, like these loaded into this gondola here. So it just needs 2 relatively short tracks and a roadway between them and an overhead crane. So that's why we decided on switching everything around. So the 2 long tracks diagonally, we're now going to feed a much larger grain elevator, forming a backdrop for the scene, and then we moved the gantry crane and the container tracks to the end because they didn't need to be anywhere near as long. Anyway, by this stage the customer was getting quite excited and instructed me to go ahead and to finish all the details. So that's what I did. Here's the final form of the staging yard. It uses all curved turnouts, 20 of them, to get 11 tracks. Trains will come down the inner helix, run around the reversing loop, and then be parked in any one of these 11 tracks. And the longest runs all the way from here to here, a distance of over 7 feet. And here is the middle deck with the city scene. Trains will arrive up the helix, climb in the outer helix where the grade is slightly less, start by crossing the Rockville Bridge, disappear under the station, briefly reappear in this area. Now there's no reason why this has to be open. It can be hidden, but since there's a crossover in there, it makes sense to bring it out into the open. So the inner track around this loop is an extension of the freight arrival track and can also be used as a lead at that end if you want it. And similarly at this end, we have another long lead which disappears under the bridge into the helix area. We've got 3 full-length passenger tracks through the station. Now southbound trains have to cross over onto the northbound main to stop at the station. but no problem because any opposing runs can use one of the other two tracks. There is a limit to how much we can get in 10 feet, even in N scale, and I had to simplify the approaches beyond what I wanted to. And something else they asked for earlier on in the process was to have at least 2 road bridges across the track joining different sections of the city, and we've got that. That was always my intention, to include those, because they do add a lot of interest to the scene. We've got plenty of city roads. I had this one come down in the station and then make a sharp turn and cross over the river. That way we've got bridges disguising where the river hits the backdrop at both ends. That's always scenically very difficult to disguise, so the bridges are a great way of doing that. Now on the top deck, in complete contrast to what we have below it, this is all open country, and of course the main line is single through here. Now schematically, the layout is a very long folded dog bone, with the staging yard and the top deck being the 2 loops. Now that means that in its simplest form, keeping the helix as a double track helix, all the main lines on the top deck are unidirectional. Trains will arrive on the outer helix, come through the coal yard area, head up another 3 laps, cross the trestle heading south, and then down the inner helix again. Now it is possible to avoid that and go to bidirectional running. Let me show you the middle deck again. If you see here, these 2 crossovers at this end of the town do allow the upper helix to be treated as 2 single track mains and running both directions on both tracks. That will allow you to have trains appearing on this scene in both directions using this intermediate town here as a passing siding. And we also wanted a small engine servicing facility for the mine switcher, and I was able to provide that. There was plenty of space. And we still have a fairly good scenery to track ratio on this level. You'll note that the trestle got even longer. At this end there is a somewhat awkward scenic situation. Now when extending one track of the helix extra laps above the other, it can only be the inner track that is extended, which means that the 2 tracks here have to cross at a very fine angle. Now because I couldn't afford to keep an extra 2 feet of the lower track in tunnel, I had to cross them on a very fine angle, meaning that this bridge here has a divided column in the middle with a flying girder system, which although rare is at least structurally feasible. If I tried to take a single span all the way from there to there, it just wouldn't look right. And then we'll need a rocky outcrop over here with dense tree cover around it to disguise where all the tracks disappear from view and disguise the awkwardness of the situation. Since the shape of the layout makes it very difficult to get your eye into a position where you can see that clearly, it should work fairly well. And note how on this level the backdrop hugs the wall all the way around the back of the 2 access openings. That's because it's easy to have the scenery high enough around here to completely hide the fascia along the back of the opening, making it look as though the scenery is continuous all the way to the backdrop. These 2 access openings will be completely invisible, unless of course you climb on a stool to have a look down. I sent this off to the customer and he is absolutely ecstatic. I got an email from him yesterday saying that he's been staring at it for hours, so I'm very pleased with the way it turned out. So anyway, I think I'm just going to sign off now. So I will see you again next week. Thanks for watching and bye for now.